Right.
We'll see. Okay, we're already past the 2 minute grace period here, and Jasper, our friend with nearly perfect attendance, if not perfect attendance, said he was going to a funeral. So, um,
Oh, yeah, he's not going to be showing up.
yeah. So, okay. Well, I guess we'll get started with just you. I mean, you know a lot about Cloud API, so um, we'll have a lively discussion, I guess, for a little bit here. But hopefully, some people will roll in. But we'll see. Um, welcome to Triton Data Center office hours. Um, Today, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Cloud API because we've talked a little bit about the history of Illumos. We've talked about open source and those things. Then we talked about SmartOS, and in the demos, the SmartOS and stuff like that. We showed the VM Atom stuff and basically provisioning in SmartOS and how to make your virtual machines. And Cloud API is one of the glue parts to turning SmartOS into Triton, right? So that gives you this API basically exposes your Triton data center to the consumer, let's say, of your cloud. Like you can have a customer, and they can use the customer portal if you want them to use that. But if they want to do stuff pragmatically, or they want to use the API because it's faster, the Cloud API is a great thing to have because public API for Triton Cloud, the end users of the cloud can manage their accounts, instances, networks, images, and other relevant details. Cloud API provides a single view of Docker containers, infrastructure containers, and hardware virtual machines owned by that particular user. So you can't. I'm not. Can you do Docker containers through Cloud API, or do you have to use Triton Docker or Docker to do that?
Um, you might be able to, but I think that when you specify the image, you might not be able to specify a Docker one because I
Okay.
think those are filtered out. But if you can, you could specify by the UUID, um, and then um, when you use SDC Docker or the Docker command through the Docker API interface that we have, it also sets a bunch of extra metadata that's specific and required for Docker to behave the way that it needs to behave.
Right.
And so you would also need to supply all of that metadata on your own through the Cloud API metadata properties. So
Yeah, it's
um,
just easier to
like
use Docker.
maybe it would work, but
Yeah,
yeah, you've got your work ahead of you if that's what you're deciding to do.
yeah, you're gonna have to add a bunch of, like you said, to add a bunch of metadata, and the command would be like super long when you can just use um, the Triton Docker API that's
Right.
exposed.
Yeah.
So, and that's why that's there. It's to kind of to ease that, so that people can use a familiar interface in Docker. But just for the note of the video that it does, like I said, it supports. So the Cloud API is, you can provision all your instances there, and then we have the separate API for Docker, which allows you to use Docker commands. But the Docker instances provisioned in Triton Cloud are full instances, right? They have a full IP stack. There's no like NAT translation as what you do with like a VM, let's say. Um,
Well, it depends on what you mean by full, because it those things are true that it gets a full IP stack. If you have fabrics enabled, then by default um, uh, it'll just have a fabric link. If you choose to expose any ports, it will automatically get an external link that'll be wired up right to the internet. The firewall filter is automatically turned on, allowing only access to the ports exposed. Um, and oh, there's one other thing I was going to say. Oh, but it's still like a single process Docker instance. So whatever your entry point is, or whatever command, you just have that one thing running. If it spawns child processes, it's going to do whatever it's going to do. Um, but it's not like an LX container where you've got like init running and a service management framework and like a bunch of background processes like cron and SSH.
Yeah,
So it's still like the Docker model where it's like a one process per container.
yeah. Yeah, so that's true too. Yeah, and so, but like I said, yeah, like we were saying, that you get those full benefits though of it not being it's OS virtualization as it should be, right? So as opposed to commonly, I mean, you do get that benefit when you use like Docker maybe on like your own machine, right? You can get some of those if you're not doing it in a VM. Let's say you do have a bare metal
Um,
instance, right? You can get
well, yeah, even with the bare metal instance, the default configuration of Docker is to use
a
like a virtual switch,
okay,
and all the instances are connected only to that.
right, okay,
And if you want to expose a port, it will do port forwarding from
right,
the like the host side, the non-containerized
right,
Linux kernel networking stack. It doesn't get dedicated IPs. It doesn't have
yes,
like direct access to the internet. That has to be brokered by the host side that is that has created it.
yeah.
Um,
So there's a lot. So and to sum it up, that means there's a lot of cool benefits to using Docker on Triton in that it simplifies a couple of things when it comes to like networking, especially where you can and I think it supports fabric networking as well. So you can have your fabric network connected to it. I think that might even be the default. But you can give it a public IP as well. So you can have your service, whatever you're running, composed in Docker, and give it the ports. And if you give it a public IP, you will be able to access it like a full normal instance, right? You can access it through the public IP, so you don't have to have that virtual switching and things like that. And then you can also use it, for instance, like I said, with the fabric networking. So you could have, let's say you have database containers, right? And you have another container for the front end. You can have the front end can contact the database through the fabric network, right? So you don't have to publicly expose something if you don't want to. But that's a little bit out of scope of this because I just want to talk mostly about Cloud API, but I did want to talk about the differences there because I did mention Docker. But yes, Cloud API itself gives you details on those. So you can, if you have a Docker container running, you can see it when you list your Triton instances and things like that, and get information about it, like the NICs and things like that. So what can Cloud API do? You can create and manage containers in hardware virtual machines, collectively known as instances, manage your account credentials, create and modify virtual private networks for instances so you can manage your fabric networks, create and modify those, manage snapshots of instances, and that will depend on how that's set up in your cloud. So if you're using a particular cloud, you may not have snapshot space setup or things like that, so that can be dependent on what features are available. Manage sub-users and permissions using RBAC. So one of the cool things about Triton identity management, right? We have the sub-users, so you can create sub-users who can have delegated access to the resources. So you can tell them, there's actually a list of permissions you can give them, and you can manage those through the Cloud API as well. Manage metadata, for example, Triton CNS, so you can mark an instance to have Triton CNS or not, and manage services that it gets. So when you provision an instance, you can say, and there's a metadata tag for like Triton CNS services. You can give it a service name, and that will create a DNS name using Triton CNS. So there's a lot of things you can do with Cloud API. It's really cool. So basically, it's a great interface to the Triton Cloud, versus you can use the portal. So for instance, we have MNX Cloud. You can use the portal, go provision instances that way. But you can also do that using the Cloud API, which I prefer to use the API just because it's quicker, right? You can go in and do stuff, and then you can also script things up, right? So you can do things, and when you're using the portal in the GUI, you're having to go click on a bunch of different things when you can automate those with an API, and that's why APIs are great. So accessing Cloud API, it's available as a REST API, and you can access it using we mentioned the customer portal. Node Triton CLI, so that's the newer uh, way to access it. And then there's Node Smart DC, which is the um, previous CLI. But I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, that there's still is there still more things in Smart DC, right, than there is still in Node Triton? Is that correct?
Um, it's it's a little bit like more raw API access
Okay.
than Node Triton. Node Triton is higher level, but Node Smart DC basically like everything's in JSON. So like you can um, when you send um, requests, you can use command line flags for the requests, but all of the responses are in JSON. So you can say like Smart DC create machine um, minus p package, et cetera, right? But then the response it gives you is going to be just the JSON object of the instance that was created or the JSON error. Whereas Triton CLI will say like, okay, it was created and here's the UUID, but it's not going to be like the full JSON object unless you use the minus J flag. But that being said, Node Triton does have an API subcommand, so you can say like Triton API whatever, and then use the API directly raw. So um, uh, in that sense, like Node Triton can do everything because uh, even like stuff that isn't explicitly written into Node Triton, um, you can call the API directly with, and Node Smart DC can't do that. So it's um, the only thing I know of that Smart DC has direct support for that Node Triton doesn't is manipulating machine metadata. But I actually have I've got some code um, written at Joint that adds support for that never got merged in. So maybe I should just take a look at that and get that done.
Okay, yeah. So I mean,
Or
I
maybe
knew
it is. Let me
it was
check.
pretty close to parity, like as far as like most of the
Yeah.
functions, right? So, um, but yeah, there's some things like if you look at the documentation that might be, like you said, it's more raw and exposed. So there's certain things that um, maybe more you can manipulate a little bit more maybe with using the smart DC, but the feature parity is almost there, and for an average consumer, no Triton will get the job done. I mean, there's nothing really that I've used that I've longed for that I might know is missing, and I'm not a super advanced user or anything like that, but no Triton does a lot of cool stuff, and
Yeah.
and one cool feature that it has too is the tab bash tab completion, and
Hmm.
that's really handy because like you get used to using that. So if you use SmartOS and Triton when you're like in a machine, right, you get used to like VM Atom and things like that, or Zlogin, where you can just press tab and get the completion. Well, we have that for Node Triton as well. So, and I'll show that a little bit later. But for instance, one of the cool things about Node Triton is when you want to SSH into a machine. Now, who wants to remember IP addresses and all that stuff like that? I do that, but one of the cool features is there's a command with Node Triton, Triton SSH, and you can give it just the name alias of the machine. Well, when you have the tab completion installed, you can type in Triton SSH, type in like the first letter or nothing, and hit tab, and it will actually show you a list of instances, right? So, like, say you have one out there, when you press tab, it'll actually call out to the API, do a Triton inst list for you, and put that as a list of available things to commands to use and help you tab complete that. So that's a really handy thing. So if you get used to using that on SmartOS, it's really handy to have it in the Triton API as well. So that's one of the cool things about the API is the tab completion. Um, there's also the Node.js SDK. So if you want to, you can write your own, like if you have an application or something that you want to have provision machines or interact with some of the data that you need, you can use that in Node.js. I think there's some other SDKs, but I'm not sure how much they're worked on. I think Triton is the main Node Triton is the main one. So and then there's REST API. So if you're using something like a Postman, Insomnia, curl, you can use just standard REST API, post, and other verbs to interact with the API as well. So there's a bunch of different options to using the Cloud API. I personally just use Node Triton for most of the time because that's got all the things that I need. But if you want to do something using curl or Insomnia where you're needing to look at data and store it and automate some things, that's what's great too. Because I use it, so Insomnia is basically like a Postman clone made by Kong, and it's kind of cool because you can set things up and then you can actually, let's say you do make a command and you can actually export that command to different languages. So you can export it. You make it the request. You can export it to Node. You can export it to curl. So you can make an HTTP request, and it will give you different options to use it in different things. Like it'll give you a command and fetch API. So if you want to use fetch, which is part of JavaScript, you can use the fetch API to do stuff. Of course, in all of this, there's some authentication that is used. So it has key verification. So if you don't have a model to send the authentication, your command's not going to work. But that is available. And then of course that says that at the bottom, if you don't want to write any code, use one of the two CLIs. And this is from the docs page directly. If you don't want to write any code, use the CLIs. But if you want to do something pragmatic, like I said, you can use the SDKs for that. And then with the SDKs, for instance, Node, you can pragmatically use Cloud API functions in your Node applications. You can even kind of I don't know why it's not updating here for the display. It's still showing the old slide, I think. Anyways, you can even kind of create your own CLI interface. So if you've ever used Node before, there's actually ways that you can use different frameworks or just the Node API itself to make your own little CLI. So let's say you have some functions or something that you use all the time. You can kind of create your own little keywords and aliases and do that through the Node SDK. So that's one thing you can do. The CLIs expose all of the functions for the consumer of the cloud, allowing efficient use of the resources. So, we have some customers that use Triton where basically the cloud is built for usage and they manage it, but then the users, of course, are the other people in the other departments, right? That use it, developers that use to build their stuff, and so they can customize things and use the CLI to work with their allocated resources. So, a lot of people think of maybe AWS. You go and spin up an instance for a development instance. Well, with Triton in your own cloud, you can use that the same kind of way where you have this compute, and you can have limits put in through Triton Data Center, so the operator would give a limit or a piece of the pie to a user, and then they can provision or not provision how much ever they want using the CLI or even the customer portal. But it's very efficient to use the API once you get used to that because you're able to automate things and do some other things that it's much quicker to do through the API. And then authorization is done through SSH keys, so environment variables can be used to store the fingerprints of your key. So it talks about this configuration in the documentation for the Triton CLI. So there's some different environment variables, and I think even Node Triton still supports the ones that are still called SDC. So if you have those set somewhere, it will still recognize those. But basically, you set your
Yeah,
username. Oh, yeah. So it does support the old ones, right?
yeah, yeah.
Okay. That's what I thought. I was pretty sure on that. I mean, I read that in the documentation, but wasn't sure if that had changed or anything, but I'm sure it hadn't. But so you have these environment variables that stores your username, the key fingerprint that you have, and then it checks that key, and then that verifies that you're able to use the resources that you are authorized to use. And so what you do usually is either when the operator adds a user, they can add an SSH key, or sometimes you give the user access to the portal with the username and password, and then they can go upload their key to their account and get started that way. And then one thing is the customer portal does support Duo two-factor authentication, so you can have two-factor authentication on the portal. I think we'll get a little bit into. I think there's some questions about different security models, but I think Brian, you touched a little bit with one of the Bruce on Discord. He was looking to do some different things, like maybe with hardware keys, things like that, and so we'll talk a little bit about that
Yeah, he
later
was
too.
asking about two-factor stuff.
Yeah.
Um,
So yeah, I mean, he didn't. I mean, like you said, there's some. Isn't there some? There's some ways that it's a REST API or that might make it harder for like the prompt to come back, right? Is that true?
well, I mean, because it's an API over HTTP, like it has to be necessarily non-interactive.
Right.
Um, so um, it's not possible really to have um, like um, like a Duo push prompt or something like that. There's no way to integrate Duo with it, or like Google Authenticator with it. But somebody did bring up like YubiKey attestation.
Yes.
So if you have a YubiKey and you generate your key with that, and the keys brokered by the YubiKey through your SSH agent, then whenever you want to use the API, it will like it needs to get access to the key, so it asks the agent asks the YubiKey, and then the YubiKey is going to require that you either touch it, or it's going to pop up a dialog to enter a PIN, depending on how the attestation was configured. And so those attested keys have an attestation configuration that's applied to them. And so Cloud API can check that chain of authority to make sure that it's validly signed. But there's not, like, if you're using an attested key, it will ensure that it validates. But there's nothing that will require that you're using attested keys. And once you have a key that works, you can add additional keys, and there's nothing
Right.
to prevent you from adding keys that are not attested. Um, so it's a little bit incomplete. It's like the primitives are there, but like right now, it just kind of has to be enforced by policy. Like, you know,
Yeah.
thou shalt only use attested keys, but that's not enforced by Triton in any way. And this discussion actually brought up, like, what could we do to allow Triton to be more strict in that regard if the operator wanted to. Um, and so I got a couple of ideas I'm thinking about, but that might be something that is possible in the near-ish future.
Yeah, and
But
that's what kind of sparked
no
my
promises.
yeah, and that's what sparked my idea to talk about this. I steal all my ideas from Discord and IRC, of course, but that's what kind of sparked the idea to talk about this was because we had a little bit of discussion last office hours, right? About we were talking about encryption at rest and we're talking about threat models, and and this came up too, where it was like he had this idea of trying to figure out how to make it more secure. And so I can't see that word either. Attestation came up, and some other things came up for his ideas like using Vault. And you were explaining like, okay, this is why this won't work, or this is how this works, right? And so, I was just wanted to bring that up because obviously people are always looking at different security and threat models, right? So security is going to depend on, like you said, your threat surface, and like what do you think is your attack vector is going to be, and things like that, and who is going to,
Right.
like, who has physical access, right? So do you need to have this and this because you think somebody's going to physically take an instance, right? And so the encryption thing comes up, or who's going to get access to a machine? Like, do you, for instance, for Bruce, they might deal with PII and HIPAA compliance and things like that. So they have probably other requirements for their users to, like, have maybe YubiKeys on their personal machines, or have passcodes for their SSH keys. But those things have to be enforced separately from Triton, because Triton doesn't, like, right now, like, wouldn't say, oh, you don't have a passcode on your SSH key. That's just built into the SSH key. That's not something we have built into
Yeah.
Triton, right?
And security parameters are not something that exist in a vacuum. Um, like you can't just say like, oh, I turned on this secure thing, and now my system is secure. Like, every security control has to be evaluated in the context of the specific threat that it's intended to protect against. Because um, any one security control is not going to protect against all attack vectors. There are specific attack vectors that each kind of control is capable of addressing, some of them incompletely. And so, like, it's really something where, like, you have to have a written threat model of, these are the kinds of attacks that we expect. And because of that, we have instituted these controls that will mitigate those types of attacks. And then, part of the threat model should also include, like, these are other things that we know are possible, but we are explicitly not accounting for because of whatever reason.
Exactly. And so, yeah, and we see, insecurity is always top of mind, because we're seeing, I'm just thinking of recent issues and attacks, like the MGM Grand attack, right? Like, that was a failure, and it's always, it seems to be humans, right? They use some social engineering to, they went on LinkedIn, use some social engineering to get an employee, and, like, got them to somehow authorize something. I'm not exactly sure of the details, but um, the security model broke down in this case because somebody gave them access. Like, there was some things in place, but it was like somebody unlocked the door, right? They got the person with the key to unlock the door, and so you
Right.
you can't
And
stop that, sometimes.
right. And at some level, security is impossible. You know, um, if the entire concept of computer security doesn't scare you, go read the paper by Ken Thompson called Reflections on Trusting Trust, where you realize nothing can be secure in any way, shape, or form. Um, and you just kind of have to get over it. Um, I mean, at some level, there's always a way to get underneath of any security control. Um, so, again, that just stresses the importance of um, having a threat model and defining um, exactly which threat vectors you're protecting against. And if you don't have that, then your security controls are pretty much meaningless.
Yeah, and especially when we think of, there's different things, like people try to do security by obfuscation, um, and a lot of times, I think of security as it's a headache for some people, right? They're like, I don't want to have to remember all these different passwords, or, man, I just want to get into this system. And so a lot of it is just being annoyed with things sometimes, in that, and that's what security kind of is it's like, it's really, um, it's just a way to slow things down, but there's people always thinking of ways to crack into stuff, and depending on what your threat vectors are, and what you're exposed to, is going to determine how much work you got to put into it. But um, so there's,
Right. Like, everybody
yeah,
wants, security to be like some magic pixie dust that keeps out all the baddies and lets all the goodies do whatever they want. Um, and like that's not really what it is.
Yeah, because the good, and then when the good people are like, I can't get into my system, I need to reset my password, or that happens, right? So like, there's
Right.
always there's always like this way you have to have password resets, and I go through this a little bit with as a lot of people probably in our space, a lot of times you're like the computer person for your family, and you're having to help with grandma's password and all that, and she writes it down on a post-it note or something like that. So there's always these people, or there's always these things being preached for security, but laziness and not knowing also, that's why there's always people willing to target things, because sometimes it's easy to do certain targets because they know this person, they don't care about security. But when you're in an organization where you're dealing with like PII or health data, um, you really have to strictly enforce those. And so, but it can be a hard process when you have people who are willing to poke holes in it because they want it to be easier and stuff like that. So it can be
Yeah,
difficult.
and it's a balancing act because um, you want to keep things out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them, but you don't want to get in the way of the people who should have access to those things. So
Exactly. And so, um, hopefully we're always looking to improve things in our product in certain ways. We have to always evaluate whether that's the right thing to do, because, we're not going to put something in there that is like, we're not just going to put a feature in because it's supposed, we think it should be there. We're going to do a good evaluation on that and understand, is this really going to serve our customers, or do they need to plan something out beforehand for their own security? But as far as it comes for Cloud API, um, it is the way it is right now, and it works. And there's other things you need to do to protect access to it, that I think right now are sufficient. VPNs for certain things. Like if you have a cloud, you don't want people to access outside of the employee network. VPN can be there, and that uses certificates and things like that. So it really determines like what your PCI compliance, all those things help determine what are you going to do for your security. So and we can't cover every base because we have a lot of different sectors to cover. So but it's a conversation we do have with certain customers, and we are looking to, there may be things like you said, I can't say the word attestation is something
yeah,
we're looking at. Um, so I just really wanted to quickly just show. Let me just fix this here. Um, so you should be able to see my terminal. I just gotta change that in OBS. Okay, great. So I'm just going to show a couple of quick commands of the of Triton. So I have an account set up. So I'll do env. So SDC URL. Okay, so I must have the old SDC variables set up. Okay, so the SDC URL. So this is the MNX Central Cloud. That's my username. So don't steal it. I'll probably change it now. And my key ID, that doesn't, can't take anything with my key ID. But basically, the variables are set so that I can use the Triton command. So since those are set, I can just do Triton inst. So it lets you use a lot of short commands. So it'd be instance list, but we have it where you can just do instance ls. So there's like some really cool short commands. So if you're using, if you're used to shorter words and things like that, it kind of lets you do that. So that's what I do like about the Triton as well. So I have one instance already running, that I was doing some testing on. I didn't even give it a name, so it has a short ID and a name. So you'll get these. This is the info it'll show. You can get a lot more information about an instance. Let me just do that really quick. So I talked about the tab completion. So when I type in Triton inst and you hit tab, it'll show you all the different options for that particular command. So I'm going to do Triton inst get, and I'm going to use the short ID. Um, and this is going to return a JSON object, which it's a lot of information, but we pipe it to you can pipe it to JSON, right, and then it will pretty print it for you. Um, and then with the JSON command, you can like if you wanted to get the IP, I think is it like Nix 0? I should have practiced this.
You can just do nix.0.
Okay, cool. So yeah, so let's say you just wanted to get an IP of an instance, you can do pipe it to JSON, and then the JSON command, which um, will let you iterate through an object or an array and find out information about that particular JSON object you're using. And so in this case, like you just thank you, Brian. Nix.0 will give us the primary NIC connected to this instance, and it will give us um, the MAC
Yeah.
address, IP
Well,
address.
it's not necessarily the primary, but it's the element 0 of the array.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
But you can do Triton instance IP instance name, and it will return the IP of the primary interface, even if that's not the first interface.
Cool. Okay. So yeah, I like to use the and then there's also there's a few other options on there, right? So there's a bunch of things you can do with the instance: enable firewall, resize it, start stop, all the usual stuff, delete it, um, and then of course create a command or create an instance as well. I have some things I've done with that, but I don't want to wait for things to provision, so I'm not going to do that. But I like the Triton inst get too because now you can get the IP address like you said with that short command or using JSON, but if you have other things like the DNS names or networks, other things that you need to look at, and of course showing uh, different information about the instance, you can get that all through this. And then if you need to pipe it to something else, you can do that as well. So that's why the API is really cool, is because you can instantly grab information about an instance without having to do 100 different clicks and all that things like that. And then of course there's, like I showed with the tab completion, there's Triton SSH, and I only have that one instance, so I hit tab, and you see it took a little pause there, but it went back and it found the only instance that I have. So I can do Triton SSH, press tab, goes and grabs the name for me, and then it automatically will do the correct SSH command because at least with LX you and SmartOS you log in as root by default on most of those, but like some of the VM instances like Ubuntu, um, they don't have you log in as root, and so it will actually automatically find the right command for that. So whatever the user is, I think it's Ubuntu is the default user for Ubuntu or something like that. But
Yeah, that delay that you saw is actually it's looking up the instance and the image so that it knows what user to use.
okay, cool. Yeah, I do. You see the little pause? It'll show on the top there. It's Node running, so it's
Yeah,
going out and running a command to go grab that info. So that's pretty cool. I like that
yeah,
because it's like I don't have to remember all the names of my instances. I love the tab completion. That's just a great feature because you get used to using it, and then it's like you just so it's like great because I'm using SmartOS and I'm doing zlogin and I'm used to that tab completion. You get that same thing here with the Triton API. So if you're doing stuff in a Triton cloud and you're used to SmartOS, it's a really good, easy transition because you are using SmartOS. You're just using an API to access some of the more advanced features. Um, and then I already have this instance up and running. I don't have anything imported on it, but it's an LX instance, so it doesn't have all the same stuff that a SmartOS zone has, but it does have. Let me see. it does have native. So um, some of the other things that you might need to use on here, like all the native commands. So I was watching a demo of SmartOS that somebody had posted on YouTube from a year ago from a conference. Um, there's a bunch of commands that you might want to use for native because in the LX zones it runs using a syscall translation, but you can still do some of the things that you need to do, like route um, and some of the other commands that they won't work because they actually do need to use the native commands to do that. So that's available to all LX instances. Is mounted is the native zone, or sorry, native folder with the applications that you might need to do some stuff on there. Okay, so yeah, so that's just the cool thing about the Triton API there. It's just really easy to use. The Triton SSH is good, and then like I said, the tab completion. So if you just type in Triton, press tab, it'll show you all the different commands that are available to you. There is a help, of course, as well. Um, so it'll give you more information about. Um, if you forget something, just go to your help, and it can um, check these out. You can do stuff. So I have, like I showed, the environment variables set previously. You can do things one off. So you can set the account, user, key IDs. You can do that all without the environment variables just by setting those as options in the actual command when you run it. Of course, the environment variables help if you're just using um, the same Cloud API destination and account, but you may be working with multiple um, different endpoints. So there is the Triton profile as well. So you can actually have different profiles set up, so you wouldn't have to do this just one off. Um, so you could do Triton profile list, and it will show you different uh, profiles you can set up. So if you have different endpoints or different users, you can set different profiles, and it will actually adjust the environment variables for that. So if you're working with multiple endpoints, different accounts, this is a quick way to do that. And there's a Triton profile create, so it'll actually walk you through the creation of a profile. So we'll just call this new profile. It gives a default Cloud API endpoint, so you just put in whatever the one is, and then it walks you through all this, and then it will actually go and check for your key ID for you. If you need to do a different one, you can do that. And then for the Docker setup, it's going to give you some different commands, but um, I'm not going to set that up right now. But anyways, that I just want to give a little quick demo of that because this is a really cool API. And like I said, you can use the Node SDK to do stuff in your own application, or with using the CLI, you can also just script stuff up using Bash, even, right? So you could just go into a terminal and write your own, like Triton prof, inst, do this, and then you can script up different actions you want for if you wanted to create some thing that you do all the time, you could just script it in Bash, and so it's a bunch of flexibility in that. So yeah, I just wanted to show off that and that's pretty much basically what I wanted to talk about today was just kind of give a little demo, talk about Cloud API, and then um, the last thing I did want to mention, and let me just fix this here, is the future of Cloud API. So like what features might like to see. What are some improvements that can be made? Any other SDKs like Rust or something like that. So yeah, if you have stuff that you want to see, let us know. If there's stuff you want to discuss. So yeah, I mean, if anybody has any comments on that, go ahead and throw them out there, and then I'll get to the stuff in chat as well.
I'd like to do a Rust SDK, and I did some work a while back to express Cloud API in the like Open API um, framework, um, that you can then um, just say like make me a Rust client, and then it just makes one. Um, so like it would be a lot easier to have that, so that clients can be generated for like any language, than to have like several different ones that we like maintain each of them individually.
Yeah.
Because like you said, um, there's the Node SDK, which is actually you can either use uh, Node Smart DC or Node Triton. Like both of those are a full SDK for Cloud API. And then there's also Triton Go, and I think there's a Python one, but they're a little bit stale. And it would be nice to be able to just have like the Open API specification, so that people could like self-generate a client for anything. Um, and then that would also make it easier to make like a command line version using Rust, instead of Node or whatever, you know.
Yeah, because isn't I mean Node is pretty like heavy, right? When it comes, I mean, if you're doing a CLI, like it's you got to have the whole Node
Um,
installed and all that. But
it it kind of depends. Like if the only thing that you're doing with Node is a Triton client, then yeah, it can be considered a bit heavy. Like telling somebody you have to go install Node first. Um, sometimes that's kind of an impediment for them. But the advantage of like a Go command line binary or a Rust command line binary is um, they're just like a single file, and they include the runtime with the binary. So we can have just like download this binary, and you can just use it without needing to have like specific versions of Node installed, or like compatibility issues when people are using different Node versions. Like Node 20, before it became LTS, um, completely broke Node Triton for a while, and so we had to tell people like, look, you can't use it because there's this bug in Node, and it's just not going to work. And thankfully, they fixed that before 20 became LTS. Um, but for a while, it was just like kind of up in the air about what would happen, because even though the bug had been reported and fixed, like that commit wasn't merged into the Node 20 branch, and there had been several releases even. Um, and like I had to contact them directly, like, dude, like when is this going in? Because it's important to us. And they're like, oh, probably, should be soon, but I'm on vacation for the next couple of weeks, and it was this whole fiasco. But yeah, having like clients, uh, end users not have to deal with that kind of frustration would be beneficial. So.
yeah, and that's a good reason for um, the stat like the runtime to go with it, right? Because then they don't have to deal with all of that. So, um, but yeah, I mean, I just thought of Rust because that's obviously a lot of people working with Rust. A lot of people like it. I know a lot of stuff is being built um, in Rust at places like uh, Oxide and things like that. So being widely used, and so it'd be nice to have something like that. But and then okay, so let's get into the chat. So Nicola asked, thinking out loud for after the main talk. So thank you everybody. If there's other stuff you want to suggest about Cloud API, we'll continue more of the discussion in Discord as well. But I'll just read what he's put here. Do you think that maintaining in sync Triton Lite community release that would require much smaller RAM to work for Soho users could be relatively easy maintained and still remain the same thing as the full Triton, like 16 gigs for the head node or 8 gigabyte in hard drives instead of 64 in SSDs? Maybe requirements for 2 machines minimum setup and requiring load on head node instead of three, head node plus two minimum. Do you think that it would be relatively easy to maintain a light requirement? And then I know it's probably best advised to have 64 gigabytes minimum for head node, but I'm just thinking out loud. Yeah, I think, and then Brian, you kind of answered that with like Triton works as little as 8 gigs RAM and 120 gigabyte Z pool. Um, but I think doesn't I mean correct me if I'm wrong, but Smart OS. I mean, what exactly? I guess my question too is like what exactly are you looking for in a Triton Light? Are you looking to have like multiple machines that you can provision? Are you looking for the part that provisions to the different machines or
Well,
something, right?
yeah, his question was a little bit specific to his use case because
Okay.
he had tried Triton before, and he was having issues where, like as he described it, services just weren't starting
Okay.
at boot time, and like stuff, like tons of stuff would just go into maintenance, and we never tracked down why. And initially, I thought it might be hardware related, um, but all the stuff that he's got should be well sufficient. I'm running Triton on things that are much less powerful than what he had, and I'm not having those issues at all. And the things that he described, like I've never seen this set of circumstances before where like services just flat fail to start up at boot time. Um, so like I'm not sure what's going on there,
Okay.
but his environment is definitely unusual. Um, but Triton, like the default configuration for Triton, is it provisions 45 gigs of memory, and three like 3.5 terabytes of disk. Um, but the actual in use footprint of Triton is significantly smaller than that. Um, Memory usage on a fresh Triton install is somewhere around 6 gigabytes, which leaves um, it's like even on an 8 gig system that leaves you a bit of RAM for doing like various VMs. Um, and the Z pool by default is only using um, about 20 or 30 gigabytes. Um, even though we're provisioning 3 terabytes, right? We're making space um, for image API in case you're loading in a ton of images, in case you're using Docker. Um, you know, um, because we need to have like a cap of how big image API can grow. But the default installation is using virtually nothing. So I ran Triton on a system with 128 gig SSD for years. Um, and, you know, really the only issue that you have with that is the more images you install in your data center, those stick around in image API. So you can clean those out periodically. It's still well within the limits of like a very small, modestly powerful server. And you can turn on provisioning on the head node, which will allow you to create instances either through admin UI or through Cloud API right on the head node. And as far as like expanding that, like multiple CNs go, like if you don't want to provision to the head node, you want to keep that dedicated for your Triton stack. You only need one other compute node in order to be able to provision. If you want to do a full HA setup, then it's best to have three. But if you're doing a full HA setup, just like with security, it has to be taken in context.
Right.
An HA configuration with Triton needs to be taken in context because if you're going to do an HA configuration, you also need to have an uninterruptible power supply along with that. Because if you ever have all three of your Manatee instances offline at the same time, then the system can go into an unbootable state. Like you don't have the ability for CNAPI to hand out IPs to new CNs that need to boot up. So you could boot your head node, but your manatee is thinks that there's two other manatees out there that it can't talk to, so it's going to refuse to do anything. Its bender thinks that there's two other benders out there that it can't talk to, so it's going to refuse to do anything. And then the rest of your API services aren't going to start properly because they expect there's something out there that's already in charge, and I'm not going to try to take over what they're doing. So I'm going to trust them, even though I can't contact them. So if you don't have like a generator for your environment, then I really don't recommend doing HA. It's not going to benefit you nearly as much as you think that it's going to.
Yeah, and I kind of think of, I think we had a little bit of discussion about this before, but we talked a little bit about like, Proxmox or XCPNG, right? What they offer as far as like a GUI and interface, and I think because we had a little bit of discussion about maybe why is there no GUI for just SmartOS and things like that, and I would think of that as almost like the Triton Lite in a way, is like something where you could have like a self-contained like web, like almost admin UI, but just for SmartOS in a way, where
Yeah,
you could
like a web app that could manage VMs on a
yeah,
on a standalone SmartOS instance. Like yeah, like
yeah,
that kind of thing could be useful.
yeah,
And if there was a community project that did that, we would probably like point people towards it.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
but
I'm not saying I'm not saying we're agreeing to build that at
yeah,
all.
yeah,
No way.
it's not something that we're going to pursue right now.
Right.
Like we have enough other things like just within Triton as it is that we would want to do.
Yeah.
Um, so and you know, like I used SmartOS for years before switching over to Triton because Triton wasn't open source at the time. Um, but there's a lot of advantages that come with Triton. Um, I was talking with somebody on Mastodon a while ago, um, and they were like, "Oh, it would be great if SmartOS had this," and I was like, "Well, that's in Triton." They're like, "Oh, well, I don't want to use Triton." I'm like, "Okay, well, that's fine. You don't have to, but the feature that you're looking for is in Triton." Um, and then they're like, "Oh, what about this? Like, there should be this." Like, well, that's in Triton. Well, I don't want to use Triton. Like, okay, that again, it's fine. Um, but that feature that you're looking for, we did implement it in this bigger thing. And then they started asking, like, well, how could I like take that and strip it down so that like I don't need Triton, but I could use it on SmartOS? And like, well, basically, you're going to have to re-implement all of Triton in order to do those things. So like, just use Triton. Um,
Yeah.
so
I mean,
yeah,
we're
I
gonna.
mean,
Oh, go ahead.
I agree. Like the target user or operator for Triton is not single server home environments. You know, um, it's really something that is engineered for a data center.
Right.
And the more compute nodes that you have in it, the more benefit that you're going to see. Um, even using Triton on a single compute node, um, if the head node is all that you have, provided that you have enough compute resources, like it's hard to buy a server with only 8 GB of RAM these days. It's hard to buy a server with less than a terabyte of storage these days. So if you have something that is, um, hardware that's even remotely modern, you can enable provisioning on it, and the head node resources are only going to take up a fraction of that. It may be a little bit big compared to like some other kinds of services or other types of systems that do this, like Proxmox or whatever. Um, but like running all of that in only about 6 GB and uh, the storage footprint, well under 100 gigabytes, um, is really not a lot, you know. And if you're doing something like just for yourself, um, it doesn't need a lot of RAM. It's never going to use massive amounts of RAM. You know, you really only start needing that once you have a lot of users and a lot of activity in the hypervisor. Um, so you could get like a modest system with 64 gigs of RAM or 128 gigs of RAM, and you've got tons of memory in order to run whatever applications or instances on it that you want to. You know, so
Yeah, and I think like
I think
because yeah,
it's not too terribly much more than going for Proxmox, but it
yeah.
seems like it on paper because it provisions 48 gigs of RAM and it provisions 3 terabytes of storage. Um, but if you allow over provisioning, and then none of that's really an issue. And for a home environment, um, like there are controls in Triton to make it more usable to a home environment. Like you can disable over provisioning checks. You can disable CPU cap checking. Things like that that make it a lot easier and a lot more flexible for home installations. And like I use those features on my Triton at home, even though mine's 4 compute nodes.
Yeah, and I think like I said, a lot of people try to compare it to, like you said, Proxmox, XCP-ng, and even KVM. I think there's some like interfaces out there, but I know it might not have the pretty web GUI, but once you provision and get things, I'm just talking about standalone SmartOS, for instance. It might take you a little couple things to figure out, but you can really efficiently use resources with SmartOS the way it is. And once you get your machines up and running, I mean, you're really just wanting to use it as a hypervisor. Once you provision, you're doing the work inside of your virtual machines or your
Your
instances.
instances,
Yeah.
yeah,
And so I think people sometimes lose sight of that and they're just like, oh, I want to do all this from this. And it's like, I understand that because I've watched quite a few videos recently on different Proxmox and XCP-ng and things like that because there's a lot of these mini like PF Sense Proxmox appliances type things that are coming out that they're like mini small form factor computers that have quite a bit of RAM and SSD and they're small, and then they have the like four to six ports of the 2.5 gig, and people want to like virtualize on those, and so I understand they kind of want something simple, but for what SmartOS does, like I have just a single. I got a HP server for like $200 off of eBay a couple years ago. It had 128 gigs of RAM and a pretty good like 16
yeah,
cores of Xeon, and I can do everything that I want. I can even do um, PF Sense. I don't want to virtualize it though, but I can do. I've done a whole bunch of different VMs using SmartOS on there, so it can be done, and it wasn't that hard. It just takes a little bit of extra just planning out my JSON file. But I think there's even a generator at like datasets.at that will help you even generate the JSON file you need. So sometimes the web GUI can
yeah.
be
There's a
overhead.
lot of examples around.
Yeah,
Like I maintain some examples that are like known working configurations, and so like people can take those and customize as needed. Um, and I can even like if somebody has a good idea of like I want to know how this feature should work in the JSON and I can't figure it out myself, like you know, I can create new examples for stuff like that.
yeah, and I think
You know,
part of it is too. Like I do understand the like I think Smart OS could be even more killer. I think with a web GUI. So maybe somebody in the community will build that, but in the short term, I that's not going to happen on our side or anything like that. But I mean, I just see so much love for SmartOS, and just reading through and seeing some cool presentations and using it myself and just discovering new features. Um, I do understand why you'd want to have, the Triton features on a smaller installation, and there's some ways to do that. So, in the future, I think, with the way that like the new servers are getting bought up, and then like there's a lot of great cheaper off lease equipment and stuff available on eBay and other places where you can actually get really good machines for super cheap, and you can even get like some small form factor computers. Like I was looking last night, and like if you just want one machine, they had like it was like $129 and you get 16 gigs of RAM and SSD and all this stuff like that. Now that's not ideal for a compute node, but you don't have to spend too much more than that to get a pretty good rack server nowadays. So if you really want a great home lab and you want to use Triton, there's ways to do it. With not spending too much on the hardware there. We're out of time here, so thank you everybody for attending. But we'll chat a little bit more in the Discord. Nicola and I are posting a couple questions, so we'll finish a lot of that on the chat. But thank you for attending, and we'll we'll look forward to the next office hours, and I'll ping everybody for topics, and we'll think of stuff to talk about. So thank you everybody.